Hey y'all, let's make an Isadora pattern. This is the romper version with the flutter sleeve and large cutout. You'll need to cut one main front on the fold and one lining front on the fold. Don't forget to add your little markings on the bottom for your cutouts. You'll need one back in the main and one in the lining on the fold, again with the cutouts and the sleeve notches. Then I have two flutter sleeves on the fold. You also need two front rompers mirror images and two back rompers mirror images. Again, making sure to use the cutout option on your pattern piece. The first step is going to be sewing the shoulders to create the shoulder seam. So put your front and back bodices right sides together and then sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then do the same for the lining pieces, putting them the front and back together, right sides together, and stitching those shoulders to create the shoulder seams. Then after you sew those, you are going to put your lining and your main right sides together, aligning the raw edges and shoulder seams, and you're going to stitch all along the neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to use my sewing machine and then I clip the corners. You're going to clip to the seam allowance but not through the seam allowance, and then I like to finish it on my serger to get a nice crisp edge, but it still has plenty of stretch. After you sew your neckline together, you will press the lining towards the wrong side, and then you're going to press the seam towards the lining and you're going to top stitch it so you are under stitching that lining so it doesn't peek out while you're wearing it, just like this. And then you're going to go ahead and give it a nice press, just like that, all along the neckline. Then you can go ahead and set your bodice aside because we're going to start working on the romper bottoms. First step is going to be to finish the cutout portion. So I'm going to press the cutout edge a 1/2 inch towards the wrong side on the front and the back pieces, and then you will edge stitch that in place. So all 4 edges of your cutouts should all be finished, and then we can move on to the crotch seams. So you're going to put your back pieces together, aligning the raw edges and the notches, and you're going to stitch along that crotch curve with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you're going to do the exact same thing with your front romper pieces as well, putting them right sides together, aligning the raw edges and those notches, and then stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then it's time to finish the cutout. So I have laid my bodice with the front piece open so the lining and the main pieces are pulled away from each other, and I found the center of my main front bodice, and I'm going to match the center front of the romper to the center of the main front bodice, and then I'm going to align that hemmed cutout edge of the romper to the marking on the bodice, and I'm going to do that on both sides. And then once it is pinned in place, I am going to take it to my sewing machine and I'm going to baste that romper front to the main front bodice just between those two cutout edges. Then once it's basted in place, I'm going to pull down that romper, and I'm going to leave my bodices so the main and the lining are separate and pulled away from each other. I'm going to start rolling the romper up toward the bodice, and I'm going to place that romper at the neckline seam, making sure the seam that we basted is nice and flat. Then I'm going to take the back bodice and I'm going to start rolling it toward that romper piece and I'm going to place it right at the neckline seam again. Then I'm going to pull the lining over those rolled bodice and front romper so that the main and the lining are right sides together. I'm aligning all the raw edges and the cutout markings, and I'm going to stitch it together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So your front romper and your back bodice are rolled inside of the lining and the main piece. Once that's sewn, I'm going to gently pull the romper and the back bodice away from the front bodice and romper, and you'll see the cutouts are all enclosed on the front. So then we're going to repeat the rolling for the back. So I'm going to open the back bodice, main and lining so they're separate, and then match the center of the back romper to the center of the main back bodice. And again, match those hemmed cutouts to the marking on the bodice, the little snips that we made along each side, and then you're going to baste that back romper in place. After you baste it in place, you're going to roll that back bodice up and put it in the neckline, and then you're going to roll the front bodice and the front romper towards the back bodice, and then pull that back lining over the rolls so that the main back bodice and the lining back bodice are right sides together. Then you're going to stitch them with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And again, once you're done, you're going to gently pull those rolls out, and both your cutouts will be finished on the front and on the back. The next step is going to be to sew the bodice side seam. So you're going to open your bodice up so the main and the lining are away from each other. And you're going to do the same thing on the back bodice, and you're going to place the main front and main back bodices together and the lining front and back together, and you're going to align those cutout seams, and we're going to pin those together and stitch them with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, creating the bodice side seams. Once these are sewn, you will press the lining towards the wrong side, and then your side seams are all enclosed. And you can give that a nice press on both sides. Next, we're going to start working on our sleeve. So you are going to take your sleeve piece and you're going to create a memory press by pressing 1/2 inch towards the wrong side along the entire sleeve hem. Then you are going to put your flutter sleeve right sides together, and you're going to stitch them together at the flutter side seam and with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then if you want to hem the flutter, you'll take that memory press and press it back up and edge stitch in place. Next, we're going to attach the flutter, so have your bodice right side out and your flutter wrong side out, and place that flutter sleeve over the bodice. You're going to align the side seam of the bodice and the side seam of the flutter, and then the notch on your flutter piece to the shoulder seam. And then you're going to ease that sleeve in place, just pin it, matching the raw edges, making sure that the linings and the bodice are, the lining and the main of the bodice are both together and everything is aligned. Then you're going to stitch the sleeve to the bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you can give those both a nice press, and again, if you wanted to go ahead and hem your flutter, you would press that memory press back up. Next, we're going to work on the romper side seam. So you're going to put the front and the back romper right sides together, aligning from the hem to the top of the cutout. I like to use my sewing machine on the top of the cutout before serging, and then go back and serge it in place. Next, we're going to put the crotch seams of the front and back together, aligning the crotch curve seam, and sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And the last step is going to be to hem both the legs. So you're going to press each leg up 1/2 inch towards the wrong side and edge stitch those in place. Then once you do that, your romper is complete. If you have any questions, as always, you can leave them down below and I will try to answer. We would love to see your Isadora if you make one. Post it in our Facebook group or tag us on Instagram at Made for Mermaids.